Hello, my name's Alana Page, and welcome to my talk about Fire from the Tree Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity, written by Andrew Solomon. I've been reading this book throughout the summer semester for Northern Vermont University through their Aims of Diversity course taught by Professor McGuff. Let's jump right into talking about the book. So, here is the cover of the book if you're looking for it. I will warn anyone if you're planning on reading it, it's quite a hefty book. I didn't realize it until it arrived on my doorstep, but it is well worth the time. Andrew Solomon launches into the book in his first chapter, which is really about himself and his role as a son to his parents, and about the differences he felt in between him and his parents. And he ends the book talking about himself as in the father role. So he kind of starts by looking and analyzing himself as the role of a child, and then ends it as him as the adult, and how he's interacting with his children. And in between that, he discusses all these different all these different groups. And when you first look at the book, you're like, what do people who are deaf, dwarfs, Down syndrome, autism, schizophrenia, disability, prodigies, rapes, crime, and transgender, how are those all going to fit together? And he ties all of these topics together through this idea of horizontal and vertical identities. Now, vertical identities are the identities that we have from our parents. So, vertical identities are passed down and they're generational. So, in my family, I have a vertical identity for the town I live in. I can take that back 4 generations that we've lived in Ragate, Vermont. The vertical identity of being a Vermonter on one side of my family. And vertical identities can even be, I'm straight. And so are my parents and my grandparents. And that I don't have any outward disabilities. Those things all make me more similar to my parents than not, and those are vertical identities. Now, horizontal identities are the things that make us different from our parents. Now, some of these are things that could be a choice, or they can be things that you have just come by in life. So, a horizontal identity for me is that I am college educated. I'm the first in my family to go to college. I'm working on a master's program. So that's a big kind of difference in identity from my parents and my grandparents to me, of there's a big difference in our education level. So that's an example of a horizontal identity. Some other examples of horizontal identities could be if you are hearing parents and have a deaf child, or if your parents are both deaf and you are a hearing child. That's still a horizontal identity from your parents because it's different, and it kind of creates separation and division. So whenever we're talking about horizontal identity, we're talking about that breaking away from your parents and it being different. And vertical means that you're aligning with them. He also spends a lot of the book, many of these things we can outwardly, we look at them as disabilities. If you're deaf, a dwarf, Down syndrome, autism, schizophrenia, disabilities. And in this case, he was talking about like large scale disabilities where you're not able to care for yourself. And then depending on where you are in the country, prodigies can also count as a disability as well, under that IDEA Act. And then there's these other categories of rape, crime, and transgender that are don't really fall into disability, but we think of them as kind of negatives in a lot of cases. Not saying that it is negative if that has happened to you, but that we think of them in a more of a negative light. And he has lots of discussions about the difference of finding identity in something and it still counting as a disability. He really dives into this in his chapters about deaf and dwarf and Down syndrome and autism and disability. Really stood out to me, but particularly when he spoke about deaf culture, or wrote about deaf culture, of that deaf is both their identity, but it's still a disability that needs to be, that we as the hearing world need to be aware of and make accommodations for, because yes, they're proud to be deaf, but they still need things. They need interpreters. They need people who know ASL. They need people who just have understanding of hearing loss and hearing aids and cochlear implants, and that there's a whole realm of technology that goes with being deaf, and that we need to have accommodations in place to allow them to access our world. And in that way, it's a disability, but there's also lots of pride in being deaf and them creating their own culture around deafness. Same with dwarfism. That Little People of America is a wonderful organization that allows dwarves to come together and have community. And so there's a lot of identity in being a little person, but it also has lots of outward effects on how they can interact with the rest of the world, because they need special equipment put into cars to drive. They need things modified in their homes, or if their homes aren't modified, they need tools to help them be able to just live within the normal kind of world, the world that's made for average height people. So I want to talk about a critique. So I myself can talk about my critique of Andrew Solomon, but while I was reading this, I did a little research. Kathryn Schultz was a writer for the New York Times. She's also a Pulitzer Prize winner, and she critiqued Solomon's book. So I just kind of want to talk about some of her ideas, and then I want to talk about some of my ideas, and my critique of his work. So she talked a lot about that Solomon is a lumper. So people in her mind can be splitters or lumpers. They either split things into lots of different piles, or they lump them all together, and she felt this book was an example of lumping all of these very different groups together and finding connections. She also feels Andrew Solomon has a bias that kids will be mini-me's, and has an expectation of parents, and she feels that that's not an expectation of all parents. So that was a critique of hers. And then I really want to pull out this quote from her that really captured a lot of Andrew Solomon's thought process, but also kind of points out some holes. So learning to overcome precisely the discomfort of its own broad inclusivity provokes our discomfort with difference. And one thing that really came out while you're reading the book is he's really advocating that we need to be comfortable with difference, where I don't know if we all have to be comfortable with it, but we need to be comfortable with discomfort. I think it's more important than just being comfortable with difference, because we can't be comfortable with everything, but we need to be comfortable with discomfort, which is kind of an oxymoron, but it's something that we all need to kind of strive for, to be okay in that kind of more of a thinking brain instead of a reacting brain. She does express quite a bit of admiration for his heart and his process and the connections that he wants to make in between all these groups. But she also feels like he's kind of gullible in making these jumps, that he's kind of far-reaching. And he also raises some moral issues of trying to make connections between children that were conceived through rape to children that were very much wanted and just happened to, in his case, he's gay, that she felt like that was a very large gap, and that making that jump kind of almost became a moral issue to try to build connection between them. Personally, when I read his book, I think he has some wonderful ideas, but I also can kind of agree with her. I felt like some of these, saw very wide connections between the deaf community and the community of little people, and kind of the interactions between parents and their children being different, I felt were very similar. But when I read the chapter about disabilities, I felt like it was a much harder connection there. I myself have a family member with extreme disabilities, and I don't feel like the struggles that our family has had are similar to the struggles that those in a deaf family have have from reading this book. And I know it's one book and one set of expectations being put out there, but they just didn't seem to quite mesh. People who have children with extreme disabilities where they're never going to be able to live alone, they kind of are more caught in this perpetual loop of they always have children. Where people who have children who are deaf, those children, if given the right tools, can go out and have completely normal lives. And I feel like that's a big difference. And I think he kind of missed that. And by missing that, I felt like it kind of tore at some of his ideas and made his connections that were very strong weaker by trying to rein in some of these connections that were a little more outlandish. Also, I am not a parent, so his chapter talking about himself as a father, I had less connection to than his first chapter talking about as a son. I'd be interested to go back and reread it maybe sometime in the future after I have children to see if there is kind of a different connection there. But for me, it was nice to see that connection between the two, but it didn't have the same meaning. I felt like it had too many other readers. So some of my major points of learning from this book and from critiquing it and reading other critiques is it really boils down to the more I've learned about diversity through reading this and doing some outside reading as well. I also read some things from Brene Brown, as well as doing some reading on racial diversity through another course this summer. But what it really boils down to is that we're all similar. And I do agree with Andrew Solomon in that we are all similar. We all have struggles. We all have challenges. We're all worried about judgments and reaching goals. And a lot of us, our goals are similar. We want to be successful. What we deem as success might be different, but we still have the same goal of success. And if we could focus more on our similarities, we could really bring ourselves together and have more greater understanding and appreciation of each other and connection. And still understand we have differences, and those differences are going to affect all of us, and we're coming from different places with different, more extreme challenges, but knowing that everyone's dealing with our own stuff and using each other to build, we would have just such a better community and, to be honest, better world. And as a teacher, I want to bring this into my classroom. For one, just this lens of remembering that we're all trying to improve ourselves. We're all having that similar struggle, but also we have similar goals. I want to bring that into my teaching practice and really use that to build connections between me and my students, but also between my students. I also want to take time to honor our differences and let kids share that if they're comfortable. Not that they have to, but if they're comfortable sharing and honoring those differences, because they are what make us all individuals, and that's what makes us all great. I also want to just have more respect for diversity. The more I've learned about diversity, the more respect I have for it. And then the last real application is I want to be more critical when I'm looking at students to think about these similarities and think about these differences and how can I help my kids by using that critical lens that I've been working on throughout my entire master's program of, okay, here's information from me. Where is it coming from? How is that going to affect our kids? How are they going to perceive it? And be ready to help them in the best way. So this is my major takeaways from the book Far From the Tree from Andrew Solomon and from Aims of Diversity through NVU. Thank you for listening, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.